Hey, Becca here, and today on ALifeLearned, I'm going to talk to you about my experiences with poverty in Canada, as well as poverty as an issue around the world in general.
Ideas are bulletproof.
There are many different measures of poverty, but basically the overall poverty line is the amount of income required to meet your basic needs. And 3 million Canadians, or about 11.6% of the overall population, live in poverty right now, me being one of those people. And it tends to affect specific areas of society, many of which I've managed to fall within. These demographics being single mothers, children, Aboriginals, mentally ill, disabled, physically handicapped, recent immigrants, and students. Something that you might have heard reference about in terms of statistics that discuss poverty rates is the low-income cutoff rate. This rate is actually often quoted by the media as a measure of poverty, even though Statistics Canada says it's not. They don't actually have a definitive measure of poverty at all. But regardless, according to these rates, as of 2008, Canada was one of the highest ranking countries among the wealthiest industrial nations of the world for poverty. Actually 20 times higher than the US, according to these statistics. And this low income cutoff rate is actually considered a rather useful measure for international comparison as well, and is rather popular among anti-poverty groups. But this brings me to a really big issue involving a misconception about poverty around the world. That is, because Canada is considered a generally wealthy country, any of the poverty issues faced by people within those countries, and anyone else in a first world country for that matter, are rather belittled or seen as less significant, because people who don't experience it firsthand tend to absent-mindedly overshadow first world poverty with a lot of the tragedies that are experienced in international poverty situations. And I'm not trying to imply that I think international issues aren't important and shouldn't be paid attention to, because they really should. They're very important and need attention. There are billions of people in the world who have inadequate access to water, inadequate access to sanitation, they have no access to electricity, and no access to education in any way. And there are countless children who die every day as a result of poverty. So of course these are very, very important issues that really do need to be paid attention to, and even though I haven't actually experienced the kind of suffering that those people have, I really have been through a lot of pain, and the idea of thinking about these people suffering genuinely does make me very emotional and make me cry as I read the statistics and listen to the videos about how much they're suffering every day. It's just not right. But what I'm trying to highlight here is not the conditions that are in different countries so much as the fact that poverty worldwide is just as significant in one country as it is in another. And again, this isn't based on the fact of comparing conditions that people are living in, but rather the fact that poverty is all happening all over the world for the same reasons, because of the same problems. Whether it's the first world or the third world, it's poor structuring in the government. But because many people in developed countries have access to the information about how desperate and destitute these conditions can be in third world countries, they tend to use this information to compare it to first world poverty and to support the mindset that those of first world poverty are doing it to themselves, and that's just not the case. Just because they aren't facing the same extreme conditions doesn't mean that it's their fault they were put in that position. It's a result of the government structure. And it's also self-perpetuating, with having people in society believing that the impoverished put themselves in the positions that they're in. They tend to treat people in that fashion. And in being treated that way, this creates a victim mentality to a lot of uneducated, impoverished people, which just forces them into a cycle where they have no other knowledge but to continue to perpetuate their impoverished conditions, either as a result of mental illness, addiction, or whatever type of coping mechanisms or mental health issues or physical health issues that might have developed as a result of living in poor conditions. And this has all been allowed to continue around the world because the true issue of poverty hasn't been addressed. And that's basically the lack of empathy that exists in the world these days as a result of how disconnected our society has become. And as I've been mentioning, this is all stemmed from the advanced hierarchical structuring of the governments of today, in which mostly only serve those at the top of the hierarchy. And these people up at the top are designing all kinds of different government programs to try and address the poverty issues and the inequality issues, but they never actually face the cause, that is, corruption. They just keep pumping more money into the issues. But it never really works, because no matter how much money they keep putting into these issues, they're never addressing the true issue of corruption, and so it never goes to where it's needed. The people who are managing the money aren't the ones who actually need it as well, and so greed and corruption are actually given a perfect environment to grow and fester. That is, these people at the top of these hierarchies are allowed access to huge amounts of money without actually knowing or having any contact with the people who really need it. This allows them to disconnect from the basic existence of others, or their needs for that matter, and thus justify that they deserve to take whatever it is that they want. So basically, because our distribution networks have gotten so vast and widespread, these people have been able to disconnect themselves or remove themselves from the human factor of their greed, causing them to really only see the benefits of their gains rather than the consequences of the losses from those they're taking from. So basically, they lose access to their ability to empathize. They don't see anyone to empathize with. This leads to poor distribution overall, which is the ultimate cause of poverty. This is what has allowed the 7 richest people in the world to earn more money than the 41 poorest countries and yet still be able to sleep at night. This terrible distribution is also what's led to the fact that we now have the ability to produce enough food to feed 1.5 times the population of the world, but sadly most of the world can't afford it, and I'm now one of those people. I can't feed myself this month. Even having gone to a food bank, it wasn't enough because they're very limited on the resources they're able to give, and you can only access them every few months. I'm in a first world country. Yes, I have access to water and sanitation. Yes, I have access to electricity and hospitals and schools. But no, I'm not okay. I'm experiencing gas cramps every day because I can't eat as often as I get hungry so that I can make sure that I have food until the end of the month. I've had to ask everybody in my family for money and pretty much have gotten no from most of them because I come from poverty, and so I'm just taking from their crumbs to try to feed my little crumbs. And so I'm coming from nothing. I educated myself, and because I'm mentally ill as a result of my poverty and the situations I've been through, I'm finding myself still in poverty. I have experienced the worst anxiety in the past week for how bad my situation has gotten. And this isn't because I don't have access to all of these basic resources that might not be in third worlds, but because I can't afford to live in my own country. And as I've been trying to express, if society were structured in a fashion where people actually had access to what was going on with each other and weren't so disconnected, in the sense that this heavy mindset still exists where people think that the poor are the poor because it's their fault. And so what I'm trying to say here is that poverty does not need to exist. Not in Canada, not in Africa, not anywhere. It's all a result of poor government structures. They're all archaic and they're not working for the people. If society was structured in a fashion where people weren't made to believe that the poor are poor simply because they put themselves there, but rather as a result of circumstance, and that we all work together to make our circumstances, then poverty wouldn't be allowed to exist. If those 7 people who are the richest in the world actually had access to the pain, suffering, and death that their greed causes, I'm quite sure they never would have sought to obtain such a greed. People aren't evil, they're just ignorant and unaware of the pain that they're truly causing. Empathy is the true key to killing poverty. Breaking down these huge, archaic, hierarchical structures so that we're in a society where people are more aware of each other and actually caring about one another. And this could very much be possible if smaller communities were established in which people could actually have a direct impact on their environment, rather than always having to appeal to a larger entity who doesn't even know who they are or care if their needs are actually met. And this isn't to say that I'm against the idea of these smaller communities grouping together into larger organizations, but rather that these smaller communities are essential for people to be able to be empathetic, which is the key to ending the suffering of poverty. Our current world is based on the idea of large governments organizing and managing large resources for large populations, and it has been proven that people do benefit from smaller communities. People can get more involved, they can know what's going on with each other, and they can actually have the ability to empathize and care. One of the biggest problems for why people don't participate in a lot of government voting and issues like that these days is because they don't feel they have an influence on their environment and on their community. This structure would allow for that. It would be a society that I'm quite sure everyone in the end wants. One where everyone works together. They try to understand, they try to build things together, rather than constantly competing and trying to establish some facade of superiority that's really only skin deep in the end. So if there's one thing I really want you to take away from this video, it's that poverty hurts. I'm suffering a lot. A lot of people in the world are suffering a lot. And the key to ending this suffering is to empathize and to spend your life being empathetic. I hope you found value in my video and you learned a few things. If you'd like to talk about your experiences with poverty or things you might know about poverty around the world, please feel free to comment below and join me again next week where I try again to share a little something I've learned in life.